So I want to tell you that I could have not imagined. I've been a rabbi now 31 years. It's hard to believe. Thank you. Thank you. It's hard to imagine that I would ever talk about what I'm going to talk about today, and that's anti-Semitism in America. I never thought that I would talk about anti-Semitism in America. And I understand, by the way, the timing of this. Last night I spoke about this to the early service, and then in the early morning, some of you have heard as well the shooting in Germany, right outside a synagogue. A couple of people killed, unfortunately. I don't know all the details because I've been here all day. But it's a different world, a changed world. I grew up in the heyday of American Jewish community. I realize that. Unlike my father, who grew up, by the way, in East Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, and when he was growing up, he would be chased home by those non-Jewish hoodlums that lived in the neighborhood. He'd have stones thrown at him, and he'd be called a kike. That was his life. I heard jokes when I was young about Jews and the stereotypes. Remember those? I remember derogatory language being used, by the way, towards Polacks and Japs. But never did I hear the term kike as a pejorative in my life. In spite of the Munich Olympic massacres that I remember so well and other terrorist attacks by the PLO that happened outside the United States, even the occasional domestic threat of the Jewish situation, I never felt unsafe as a Jew in America. In fact, I was growing up here when we continued to achieve greater and greater success in all areas of life. The doors were opened and we were achieving unparalleled success. America, from the arrival of the first Jew, by the way, we believe sometime in the 1650s, actually a single Jew comes to America. And then in 1654, a group from 23 Sephardic Jews who came from Recife, Brazil, and they were escaping the Inquisition, that America had always been a place that Jews could find safety. For Jews of Eastern Europe in the turn of the 20th century, America was the Golden Medina. Right? This was the place where Jews could live in safety and prosper in ways that were unknown, even with outward anti-Semitism. In the 1930s, Father Coughlin had a radio show in which he spouted anti-Semitism to 30 million listeners a week. Henry Ford, a known anti-Semite, publishes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a document that supposedly written by Jews that tells of how we're going to take over the world. In spite of all that, the Jews who were coming here in the 20th century, they felt as if this was the land of opportunity, which tells you how bad Eastern Europe was, even before the Holocaust. In the first half of the 20th century, quotas for college acceptance, exclusion from certain clubs, whether they were golf clubs or other social clubs, they kept Jews at a disadvantage and somehow every now and then segregated. But then the second half of the 20th century, things began to change. At first, it was the token Jew to show that they were open and inclusive. But then welcomed into all areas of Jewish and of American life, to the business life and to the political life, you name it. Like the Iron Curtain, really, coming down. Jews now could be involved in so many areas. Any area of America, you could grow up even to think about being a Jewish president, certainly vice president. Jews were welcome all over. In the 1950s, by the way, already, Jews are considered as part of the tripartite religious identification of America of Catholics, Protestant, and Jews. A small minority, but yet we're included in this American myth that talks about the Judeo-Christian values that are the very fabric of this country. We were being welcomed into that fraternity. That's an amazing concept. Perhaps most reflective of Jewish social acceptance was the fact that previously, for a non-Jew to marry a Jew was seen as being marrying down into a lower class. But by the latter part of the 20th century, that's not the case. And if you want to call it success, I don't know if it is, but Jews are marrying into some of the finest, prestigious American families and being accepted. That's what Jewish life was for me. And internally, by the way, you should know it was unparalleled, the Jewish development within America. The number of Jewish studies departments in universities and chairs that offer Jewish studies is unprecedented in history. Jewish publication houses and publication of books, Jewish camps and day schools, thriving as a Jewish community. This is what I grew up in. We had made it, or so we thought. But there's now a new strain of anti-Semitism that has been renewed and that's shaken us. And I don't know about you, but I was not prepared for it. There are those people, by the way, Jews who have come from Iran. There are those who have come from South Africa who always said, just wait. That's what people are about. Jews won't be accepted. But we wanted to believe that America was different. Anyone who traveled to Europe in the last 30 years knew what it was like to try and get into a synagogue in countries in Europe and other places around the world. How many of you have been to a place around the world in which you had to prove that you were Jewish before walking in? With armed guards, very often Israelis, who would make sure, especially on Shabbat and holidays, and if you absolutely couldn't prove it, you were turned away. And every time I would come back from one of those trips, and you might have as well, we would always say, thank God for America. But now things have changed. The golden of Medina doesn't feel so golden. I never thought our synagogue would require on a daily basis 3 guards, 2 of whom are armed guards, and additional ones on our high holy days. I never imagined that that's the America that I would live in. 2 recent books you need to know about if you don't already, and you really should read. One by Emory professor Deborah Lipstadt, and the other by a woman named Barry Weiss. Currently, Barry is on the staff of the New York Times, and they explore anti-Semitism in America. Deborah Lipstadt comes from it as a historian. She wrote a lot about the Holocaust. And Barry Weiss came from it from a very personal standpoint. For Deborah Lipstadt, by the way, the turning point in America for her was Charlottesville. It was there that she knew that something different was happening. And for Barry Weiss, who's a native of Pittsburgh, it was the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue, where her father actually goes to pray most Shabbat mornings, and that Shabbat just didn't happen to be in the synagogue. But that is what sent her on the journey to explore anti-Semitism. During the last 20 years, Americans in general have felt less safe, haven't we? About going out to concerts, especially outside. Even movie theaters sometimes when certain movies are playing and there are rumors of violence. Nightclubs. How many shootings have taken place in the United States in the last 5 years? More than we want to imagine. One not too far from here just a year ago in Thousand Oaks. We have become afraid. But to turn the violence against Jews, didn't think that would happen. I felt safe. Many of you felt safe. But we're not alone in that feeling of vulnerability. For many American Jews, it came as a surprise, believed America could be different. So now the question is, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with this anti-Semitism? How do we make sense of the new reality? How should we react? And most importantly, how do we live our lives? That's what I want to explore. According to Deborah Lipstadt, here's her definition of an anti-Semite. I'll probably have to give it to you twice to have full impact. But here's what she says. The definition of anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is necessary. Someone who hates Jews more than is necessary. We know already the status of Jews early on in the Bible. You just look at the book of Esther. Why were the Jews hated? Why was Haman chosen and the Jewish people in general? Because we were different. Just because we acted different and we had different laws and customs. And we refused to assimilate. And in part, the refusal to be like anybody else that's laid the foundation for anti-Semitic accusations. That's what's been thrown at us for millennia. You won't fit in like everyone else. I could lecture about the history of anti-Semitism, but in the end, it won't help us to understand why Jews are still scapegoated and why it's increasing. From the killing of Jesus to the Black Plague of the 14th century, Jews have been blamed for just about everything. From the worldwide depression of 1930s, yes, that was our fault. 9/11 was our fault. And this idea that we even have a plan to take over the world. And it's our disproportionate numbers, so small compared to the larger population. It's been some of those achievements and ideas that have led people to believe that we can always achieve more than our numbers would determine. Yes, our success is part of the problem. There's a joke, possibly from Germany, that tells of two Jews who are in the park and they're sitting on the bench, one of the few benches that Jews were allowed to sit in. And one of the men is reading the local Jewish publication. The other is reading the Nazi publication Der Stürmer. The one reading the Jewish newspaper asks, "Why on earth are you reading that thing?" His friend responded, "When I read a Jewish publication, I hear our woes and terrible fate. When I read Der Stürmer, I read how we control the banks, world media, international governments, and how powerful we are. I much prefer that one." Lipstadt believes that anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that's so irrational that you actually can't argue it rationally. In fact, if you know anything about Deborah Lipstadt, she was the one who would refuse to debate Holocaust deniers on television or any public venue because she said it is not a rational discussion that we're having. Dispersed from our ancestral land 2,000 years ago, we are forced to live in many places throughout the world. We're unique in the fact that we are defined both by ethnicity and by religion. We're very often limited in by the ruling powers as to how we could make a living, but somehow we would turn that into a profit and success. So many different accusations, so many different times that helped to create civilizations that we became the scapegoat. You see, if you survive long enough and you refuse to assimilate, if you refuse to give in and to be like everybody else, if you hold on to who you are, if you continue to flourish, you become the cockroach of humanity. And that's what the Jews are to many. In the words of Barry Weiss, quote, "Anti-Semitism successfully turns Jews into the symbol of whatever a given civilization defines as its most sinister and threatening qualities. When you look through the dark lens, you can understand how, under communism, the Jews were the capitalists. Under Nazism, the Jews were the race contaminators. And today, when the greatest sins are racism and colonialism, Israel, the Jew among the nations, is being demonized as the last bastion of white racist colonialism. A unique source of evil, not just in the region, but in the world. Whatever role the Jews are needed for," she writes, "well, that is the part that we are forced to play." So what is new about this anti-Semitism? Well, Lipstadt acknowledges that there have always been polite anti-Semites. That's what she calls them. The ones who would speak quietly in the corners and would have a joke that had slight connotations of irreverence towards Jews or stereotypes. But they weren't dangerous, they were polite. But she argues now that we need to begin to call out that kind of anti-Semitism. Lipstadt and Weiss both acknowledge that new anti-Semitism is propagated. I want you to hear this, because some of you are only going to hear one part of this. I want you to hear both. That's propagated by the far left and the far right. Let me say that again. by the far left and by the far right. And they each are receiving and achieving legitimacy, and that's the problem, they say. From the far right, to the white supremacists who are attaching themselves to the rising star of the alt-right. You could tell the anti-Semites of yesteryear. Remember, they were easy to tell. They wore white hats, sharp at the top. Or they wore costumes, they wore uniforms inspired by the Nazis. Or they had Nazi-era tattoos. We knew what they looked like because then they would shave their head and you would call them a skinhead. What's dangerous today is the anti-Semites don't look any different. And they want to be legitimized and they want to be normalized. And we need to call them out. It's almost impossible to know by their looks today who is an anti-Semite and who is not. When their voices are attached to the debate between nationalism and globalism, they gain legitimacy. When the marchers in Charlottesville are not called out for their anti-Semitism, in spite of the chance that they were giving, the Jews will not replace us, when they're not called out, anti-Semitism gains legitimacy. That is part of the problem. From the far left as well. We have anti-Semitism that's camouflaged as anti-Israel attitudes and actions. When it comes to marches and programs, a number of liberal groups have forbidden participation of Jewish groups. Or, by the way, made their stands on Israel so problematic that that Jewish groups could not be involved. Many organizations have determined and defined the Star of David to be a symbol of hate and oppression and will not allow it to be used in any of their publicity. Lipstadt and Weiss point out these examples and others and explain how many liberal American Jews have difficulty accepting this reality, this form of anti-Semitism. For Lipstadt and Weiss, one of the great mistakes the Jewish community is making is to blame the other side without acknowledging the anti-Semitism emanating from their own political group. Each side believes that the other is more responsible for that anti-Semitism. But nothing can be done until we acknowledge the danger of both sides and speak out about it. This needs to be an important takeaway, that we have to call out all forms of anti-Semitism. By the way, Weiss and Lipstadt point out the problem of the role of radical Islam in inciting hatred as well. They take to task and talk about the issue more so, they say, in Europe right now as an issue than in the United States, but acknowledge that reality. What else makes the new anti-Semitism particularly virulent? The internet. You can go on and find all kinds of anti-Semitic trash. But there's much more than you can find. Do you know about the dark web or the deep web? I've just learned about this. So these are areas, the dark web, that no search engine will find. So if you were to put up, I hate the Jews, you wouldn't find many of these places. You'll find some of the ones above. And the deep web, rather, is the one in which you actually have to have special software in order to be able to access it. But that's where these people are gathering. They're gathering in these rooms on the web, and they're finding one another. You see, you don't have to have a secret mailing list anymore for an anti-Semitic group. You don't have to find a clandestine room to meet in. They're there on the web and inspiring one another. If you've heard of 8chan, you should. 8chan is the deep web, and this is where the attackers of Christchurch, New Zealand, Dayton, Ohio, and Poway, all three of those shootings, posted before the attack of what they were about to do. And when it came to Christchurch, 27 minutes was live stream of the attack until it was finally turned off. Those are the areas where they're finding each other and inspiring each other towards violence. We know what the rise of anti-Semitism means for the Jewish community, but what about the rest of the country? It's been said that the Jews are like the canaries in a mine. When anti-Semitism is allowed to exist other forms of hatred will flourish as well. We all know that in Nazi Germany, it wasn't just Jews that were taken to the death camps. There's also the Romani, those who were called gypsies, and those deemed as homosexuals, and others who were deemed to be inferior, and they were taken along. We simply were the canaries in which others would fall to hatred as well. Last year, in the face of a lot of the attacks against Muslims, and a lot of the anti-Muslim sentiment that was taking place in the country, we had a program with our neighbors at the Ezi Masjid, wonderful neighbors. And I asked one of their members, their congregants, I said, how are you feeling about this anti-Muslim attitude that's taking place in America? And he said, what concerns me the most is the increase in anti-Semitism in this country. If after 200 years of proving yourselves as loyal citizens, committed to the betterment of this country, you who have been so good here, and there's still anti-Semitism, what does that say for our future? It was a chilling moment. One response to anti-Semitism is to oppose all racism and hatred. Because when you espouse one hatred for any group, you are allowing hatred of Jews. Become a permissive place. When we accept hateful speech about Muslims as a group or Mexicans as a nationality by anyone, we are allowing anti-Semitism to be part of the culture as well. And we need to understand that. So what are we to do? We must call out anti-Semitism when it occurs. We need to, even in the shadow of the Holocaust, when we thought that it would never become acceptable to be anti-Semitic, we need to be able to call out now people who exhibit those ideas and who share them. But calling out anti-Semitism is a little bit more complicated, by the way, because sometimes, not sure. Sometimes, by the way, you don't want to give publicity to those groups because that's what they do want. For Lipstadt, by the way, she says, sometimes a swastika painted by a stupid teenager is not an anti-Semitic threat. She says we need to understand when to stand up, when to make the issues, and to fight against this new strain. In addition to speaking out against all forms of hatred, we must form alliances with other religious communities. And that's important. These alliances will be more important in the future. We've been doing it for quite a while. Many of you know, with St. Bernardine's next door and with Greater Zion Church in Compton. And each one, by the way, different relationship. Next door at the church, first it was Father Mac and now Father Michael. What did they learn from me? They learned that their scripture sometimes presents Jews in unflattering language. And once they had that realization, understanding, they were able to talk about it differently and teach it differently to their congregation. That's a powerful relationship. In Greater Zion Church, it's been about racism against African Americans and anti-Semitism here. And he and I have very deep, serious talks, the Pastor Fisher and I, about Israel and his desire to stand up in favor of Israel. Those are important alliances. What else? I'm going to say this again. We must call out anti-Semitism on our own side. Whether on the left or right politically, we need to call it out and to be honest about it. We can't be hypocritical. Finally, and most importantly, is not to allow anti-Semitism to define what it means to be Jewish. And this here I want you to wake up for, all right? I want you to hear this part because this is the most important part of what I want to say. I want to say that we have survived not because we sought survival, but rather we survived because our values and celebration of life and commitment to be the light unto the nations meant that we lived with purpose. Survival for the sake of survival is to live the life of a cockroach. That's not what we're about. Our teaching says that we are made in the image of God and we are a kingdom of priests. And when you put that together, that's the power you create of the individual and a people to make a difference. And that's what we need to hold on to, is that to live a Jewish life is to be full of life, to be full of energy, to celebrate the life cycle events that we have. See, anti-Semitism can waken up the assimilated Jew, but it's not what it means to be Jewish. Although we must live with anti-Semitism, we cannot live in it. In the words of Barry Weiss, Jews did not sustain their magnificent civilization because of the anti-Semites. They sustained it because they knew who they were and why they were. They were lit up not by the fires from without, but by the fires in their souls. And sure, we must have armed guards, but if you really want to fight anti-Semitism, then live a Jewish life of meaning. Celebrate our holidays because they celebrate life and convey values. From the importance of freedom on Passover, the importance of education on Shavuot, our values are embedded into our observances. We're a people of the book, so read our books. Pass them on to your children. We are a people who have been persecuted, but that persecution has not defined us. At the beginning of every Shabbat, we fill up a cup of wine to show that life is supposed to be full of joy. And even on this day when we fast, we're not supposed to be punishing ourselves, but rather to be creating new insight and new understanding to make change. The High Holy Days don't conclude, by the way, with today. Your fast will. But the High Holy Days continue through Sukkot. Sukkot's a holiday that we take outside into a sukkah. You see, because Judaism is supposed to be taken out into the world. You're supposed to live it joyously. It's supposed to be part of who you are and who we are. Ultimately, anti-Semitism is not a threat to our survival as much as losing our purpose. That is when we can worry. We need to be cognizant of anti-Semitism, but we need to be aware of what it means to live Jewishly. This is a year which I pray for us. There should be less anti-Semitism. There should be more Jewish joy. May it be a year of life and filled with purpose. May we be stronger. May we fight against that anti-Semitism, but may we also find the joy of living Jewishly. That's what this year should be. I wish all of you a Gemar Chatima Tova. This should be sealed for a good year.